All right, so this is page night, pages 98 to 106. And um, so prior to this, Ellie and his father had been on a death march, and they were taken outside of Gleiwitz to about 30 for a 30-minute march, and they were waiting by the train tracks, and they were finally put into cars, 100 people in each car, and they were so skinny they all fit, and so that's where we're leaving off. The cattle cars, they do not have roofs on them, and so if you can imagine riding in a cattle car without a roof in it, and it's snowing, and it's cold, and the air is going by. So that's what they're doing right now. Pressed tightly against one another in an effort to resist the cold, our heads empty and heavy, our brains a whirlwind of decaying memories, our minds numb with indifference. Here or elsewhere, what did it matter? Die today or tomorrow or later? The night was growing longer, never ending. When at last a grayish light appeared on the horizon, it revealed a tangle of human shapes, heads sunk deeply between the shoulders, crouching, piled one on top of the other, like a cemetery covered with snow. In the early dawn light, I tried to distinguish between the living and those who were no more, but there was barely a difference. My gaze remained fixed on someone who, eyes wide open, stared into space. His colorless face was covered with a layer of frost and snow. My father had huddled near me, draped in his blanket, shoulders laden with snow. And what if he were dead as well? I called out to him. No response. I would have screamed if I could have. He was not moving. Suddenly, the evidence overwhelmed me. There was no longer any reason to live, any reason to fight. The train stopped in an empty field. The abrupt halt had wakened a few sleepers. They stood looking around, startled. Outside, the SS walked by, shouting, "Throw out all the dead! Outside, all the corpses!" The living were glad. They would have more room. Volunteers began to task. They touched those who had remained on the ground. "Here's one, take him!" The volunteers undressed him and eagerly shared his garments. Then two gravediggers grabbed him by the head and feet and threw him from the wagon like a sack of flour. There was shouting all around. "Come on, here's another! My neighbor, he's not moving!" I woke up from my apathy only when two men approached my father. I threw myself on his body. He was cold. I slapped him. I rubbed his hands, crying, "Father, father, wake up! They're going to throw you outside!" His body remained inert. The two gravediggers had grabbed me by the neck. Leave him alone. Can't you see that he's dead?" "No," I yelled. "He's not dead. Not yet." And I started to hit him harder and harder. At last, my father half opened his eyes. They were glassy. He was breathing faintly. "You see," I cried. The two men went away. So here, this is another example of resilience. He went from like, what's the purpose of living? And then again, his father, he was worried his father was dying, and he fought off the people who were trying to get the people who had died on the cattle car out of the cattle car, and he fought them off. 20 corpses were thrown from our wagon. Then the train resumed its journey, leaving in its wake, in a snowy field in Poland, hundreds of naked orphans without a tomb. We received no food. We lived on snow. It took the place of bread. The days resembled the nights, and the nights left in our souls the dregs of their darkness. The train rolled slowly, often halted for a few hours, and continued. It never stopped snowing. We remained lying on the floor for days and nights, one on top of the other, never uttering a word. We were nothing but frozen bodies, our eyes closed. We merely waited for the next stop to unload our dead. There followed days and nights of traveling. Occasionally we would pass through German towns, usually very early in the morning. German laborers were going to work. They would stop and look at us without surprise. One day, when we had come to a stop, a worker took a piece of bread out of his bag and threw it into a wagon. There was a stampede. Dozens of starving men fought desperately over a few crumbs. The worker watched the spectacle with great interest. Years later, I witnessed a similar spectacle in Aden. Our ship's passengers amused themselves by throwing coins to the natives, who dove to retrieve them. An elegant Parisian lady took great pleasure in this game. When I noticed two children desperately fighting in the water, one trying to strangle the other, I implored the lady, "Please, don't throw any more coins." "Why not?" said she. I like to give charity." So in this section here, it's kind of when you're giving charity and you watch the people fight over, it's not a good thing. It's in like you're looking at it as if they're animals and you're not really necessarily helping the situation. In the wagon where the bread had landed, a battle had ensued. Men were hurling themselves against each other, trampling, tearing at, and mauling each other. Beasts of prey unleashed, animal hate in their eyes. An extraordinary vitality possessed them, sharpening their teeth and nails. A crowd of workmen and curious passerby had formed all along the train. They had undoubtedly never seen a train with this kind of cargo. Soon, pieces of bread were falling into the wagons from all sides, and the spectators observed these emaciated creatures ready to kill for a crust of bread. A piece fell into our wagon. I decided not to move. Anyway, I knew that I would not be strong enough to fight off dozens of violent men. I saw, not far from me, an old man dragging himself on all fours. He had just detached himself from the struggling mob. He was holding one hand to his heart. At first, I thought he had received a blow to his chest. Then I understood. He was hiding a piece of bread under his shirt. With lightning speed, he pulled it out and put it in his mouth. His eyes lit up. A smile, like a grimace, illuminated his ashen face and was immediately extinguished. A shadow had lain down beside him, and the shadow threw itself over him. Stunned by the blows, the old man was crying, "Mère, my little Mère, don't you recognize me? You're killing your father. I have bread. For you too, for you too." He collapsed, but his fist was still clutching a small crust. He wanted to raise it to his mouth, but the other threw himself on him. The old man mumbled something, groaned, and died. Nobody cared. His son searched him, took the crust of bread, and began to devour it. He didn't get far. Two men had been watching him. They jumped him. Others joined in. When they withdrew, there were two dead bodies next to me, the father and the son. I was 16. So he's pointing out how awful this is because he's 16 years old, and if you can imagine being 16 years old and watching people just go after each other to make sure that they have a piece of bread in this way, with that they weren't really acting human anymore. Was That's not something you should be seeing when you're 16. In our wagon, there was a friend of my father's, Meyer Katz. He had worked as a gardener in Buna and from time to time had brought us some green vegetables. Less undernourished than the rest of us, the attention had been easier on him. Because he was stronger than most of us, he had been put in charge of our wagon. On the third night of our journey, I woke up with a start when I felt two hands on my throat trying to strangle me. I barely had time to call out, "Father!" Just that one word. I was suffocating, but my father had awakened and grabbed my aggressor. Too weak to overwhelm him, he thought of calling Meyer Katz. Come quickly, someone is strangling my son." In a few moments, I was freed. I never did find out why this stranger had wanted to strangle me. But days later, Meyer Katz told my father, "Shlomo, I'm getting weak. My strength is gone. I won't make it. Don't give in, my father tried to encourage him. You must resist. Don't lose faith in yourself. But Meyer Katz only groaned in response. I can't go on, Shlomo. I can't help it. I can't go on. My father took his arm, and Meyer Katz, the strong one, the sturdiest of us all, began to cry. His son had been taken from him during the first selection, but only now was he crying for him. Only now did he fall apart. He could not go on. He had reached the end. On the last day of our journey, a terrible wind began to blow, and the snow kept falling. We sensed that the end was near, the real end. We could not hold out long in this glacial wind, this storm. Somebody got up and yelled, We must not remain sitting. We shall freeze to death. Let's get up and move. We all got up. We all pulled our soaked blankets tighter around our shoulders, and we tried to take a few steps, to shuffle back and forth in place. Suddenly a cry rose in the wagon, the cry of a wounded animal. Someone had just died. Others close to death imitated his cry, and their cries seemed to come from beyond the grave. Soon everybody was crying, groaning, moaning. Cries of distress hurled into the wind and the snow. The lament spread from wagon to wagon. It was contagious. And now hundreds of cries rose at once, the death rattle of an entire convoy with the end approaching. All boundaries had been crossed. Nobody had any strength left, and the night seemed endless. Meyer Katz was moaning. Why don't they just shoot us now? That same night, we reached our destination. It was late. The guards came to unload us. The dead were left in the wagons. Only those who could stand could leave. Meyer Katz remained on the train. The last day had been the most lethal. We had been 100 or so in this wagon. 12 of us left it, among them my father and myself. We had arrived in Buchenwald. At the entrance to the camp, SS officers were waiting for us. We were counted. Then we were directed to the Appelplatz. The orders were given over the loudspeakers. Form ranks of fives. Groups of 100. 5 steps forward. I tightened my grip on my father's hand, the old familiar fear, not to lose him. Very close to us stood the tall chimney of the crematorium's furnace. It no longer impressed us. It barely drew our attention. A veteran of Buchenwald told us that we would be taking a shower and afterward be sent to different blocks. The idea of a hot shower fascinated me. My father didn't say a word. He was breathing heavily beside me. Father, I said, just another moment. Soon we'll be able to lie down. You'll be able to rest. He didn't answer. I myself was so weary that his silence left me indifferent. My only wish was to take the shower as soon as possible and lie down on a cot. Only it wasn't easy to reach the showers. Hundreds of prisoners crowded the area. The guards seemed unable to restore order. They were lashing out left and right to no avail. Some prisoners who didn't have the strength to jostle or even to stand sat down in the snow. My father wanted to do the same. He was moaning. I can't anymore. It's over. I shall die right here. He dragged me toward a pile of snow from which protruded human shapes, torn blankets. Leave me, he said. I can't go on anymore. Have pity on me. I'll wait here until we can go into the showers. You'll come and get me. I could have screamed in anger to have lived and endured so much. Was I going to let my father die now? Now that we would be able to take a good hot shower and lie down? So right here, this is also a sign of resilience, right? Realizing how far he's come, and he wants to make sure to move forward. Father, I howled, Father, get up right now. You will kill yourself. And I grabbed his arm. He continued to moan. Don't yell, my son. Have pity on your old father. Let me rest here a little. I beg of you. I'm so tired. No more strength. He had become childlike, weak, frightened, vulnerable. Father, I said, you cannot stay here. I pointed to the corpses around him. They too had wanted to rest here. I see, my son. I do see them. Let them sleep. They haven't closed an eye for so long. They're exhausted. Exhausted. His voice was tender. I howled into the wind. They're dead. They will never wake up. Never. Do you understand? This discussion continued for some time. I knew that I was no longer arguing with him, but with death itself, with death that had already chosen. The sirens began to wail. Alert! The lights went out in the entire camp. The guards chased us toward the blocks. In a flash, there was no one left outside. We were only too glad not to have to stay outside any longer in the freezing wind. We let ourselves sink into the floor. The cauldrons at the entrance found no takers. There were several tiers of bunks. To sleep was all that mattered. When I woke up, it was daylight. That is when I remembered that I had a father. During the alert, I had followed the mob, not taking care of him. I knew he was running out of strength, close to death, and yet I had abandoned him. I went to look for him. Yet at the same time, a thought crept into my mind. If only I didn't find him, if only I were relieved of this responsibility, I could use all my strength to fight for my own survival, to take care only of myself. Instantly, I felt ashamed of myself forever. I walked for hours without finding him. Then I came to a block where they were distributing black coffee. People stood in line, quarreled. A plaintive voice came from behind me. Eliezer, my son, bring me a little coffee. I ran toward him. Father, I've been looking for you for so long. Where were you? Did you sleep? How are you feeling? He seemed to be burning with fever. I fought my way to the coffee cauldron like a wild beast, and I succeeded in bringing back a cup. I took one gulp. The rest was for him. I shall never forget the gratitude that shone in his eyes when he swallowed this beverage. The gratitude of a wounded animal. With these few mouthfuls of hot water, I had probably given him more satisfaction than during my entire childhood. He was lying on the boards, ashen, his lips pale and dry, shivering. I couldn't stay with him any longer. We had been ordered to go outside to allow for cleaning of the blocks. Only the sick could remain inside. We stayed outside for 5 hours. We were given soup. When they allowed us to return to the blocks, I rushed toward my father. Did you eat? No. Why? They didn't give us anything. They said that we were sick, that we would die soon, and that it would be a waste of food. I can't go on. I gave him what was left of my soup, but my heart was heavy. I was aware that I was doing it grudgingly. Just like Rabbi Elihu's son, I had not passed the test. All right. So they went on this very long train ride, and they ended up at the concentration camp Buchenwald, and his dad is pretty sick, but he keeps trying to keep him going, and it's really hard because it's hard not to just to think of his own survival and to help his dad. And as he's giving his dad the soup, he feels bad because he feels like, okay, I could really use some soup. So, but he's still doing the action. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. All right. So that's the end of this particular reading. If you remember Rabbi Elihu's son, he let him, he ran when they were running or marching, he left him behind. And so, Ellie had he didn't think highly of him. So that's like, he feels like he's acting like him. All right.